Hello, everybody, and welcome to another week of Quarantine Sunday School brought to you by, well, nothing and no one in particular. Thanks a lot if you're watching this for taking the time out of your busy schedules to take a peek at what we have to offer. Today's lesson is going to cover Mosiah chapters 7 through 10. So that's where we're going to be. And there's actually two very distinct sections. 7 and 8 are plot line sorts of chapters. 9 and 10, we start to kick off the records of the people of that left Zarahemla to go back to their original homeland. So we're probably going to focus mostly on the front half of it, as is my want. I'm going to try and deep dive into chapter 7 and a little bit of chapter 8 in order to set the stage. As I mentioned, there's a lot of plot line or story points that we're going to be looking at here. So it's less doctrinal than maybe some of the stuff that we've been covering, especially King Benjamin's speech. But there are some object lessons that we can point out, and it's very important as far as the narrative goes. And so we're going to be setting the table. There's going to be some foreshadowing. There's a lot of action implied, certainly, as we read through it. So let's dig into it. If we start to look at chapter 7, we have Mosiah, the new king, has been on the throne for 3 years. Now, what kind of person is Mosiah? We can actually look at chapter 6. The last two verses are 6 and 7. And it says that it came to pass that King Mosiah did walk in the ways of the Lord, and did observe his judgments and his statutes, and did keep his commandments in all things whatsoever he commanded him. So if we look at last week's lesson and we start to see what it is that we need to do in order to apply the atonement, it was trust in the Lord, believe in Jesus Christ, and obey the commandments. And so if we look at that, we can see that Mosiah is somebody who did that. He walked in the ways of the Lord. He observed his judgments and his statutes, and did keep his commandments in all things. So good guy, it looks like. And King Mosiah did cause his people that they should till the earth, and he also himself did till the earth. So he follows the example of his father, King Benjamin, that he wouldn't become burdensome to his people in accordance to what his father did. So he learned some lessons. He obeyed the commandments. He's somebody who's applying the atonement in his life. And we find out in chapter 8 that he's also has a special title of seer as well. So somebody who has a significant responsibility and stewardship for the people over and above being just the king of the people. He's also somebody who works for his own food. He tills the ground himself. He's not a burden to the people, which is certainly the opposite of the king that we're going to be getting into in the next week's King Noah, as we'll find. So we'll be introducing that. Now in verse 7, or chapter 7, verse 1, it came to pass that after King Mosiah had had continual peace for the space of 3 years, he was desirous to know concerning the people who went up to dwell in the land of Nephi. Whew. And isn't that a drink? Or in the city of Lehi, Nephi. For his people had heard nothing from them from the time they left the land Zarahemla. Therefore, they wearied him with their teasings. So we have this scenario, and it's probably not an uncommon one. We've got 3 years of peace, and 3 years of peace, that's a good thing. There's prosperity. People are going to be able to put away food stores. They're going to be able to get ahead, right? When you're in constant conflict, the one thing that you notice, especially with whether it's the hunter-gatherer people or whether it's the farmers and ranchers that the Nephites were more likely to be, as we look at that, in times of peace, they're able to till the earth. They're able to grow their crops. They're able to put away extra. They're able to have moments where they're not subsistence living, and they don't have bad guys coming and stealing their stuff. They don't have to leave their crops in the ground and go fight as part of a citizen militia. They're able to focus on what it is that they're trying to do. They're able to get ahead. They're able to make sure that they've got enough food to get through the winter. And they're also able to think about other things rather than where's my next meal going to come from. And it looks like they're in that scenario, right? The Pax Mosiah, the peace of Mosiah. And so they now have a chance to start thinking about, hey, I wonder what happened to those guys that left here. I wonder how they're making out. And it looks like the people have come to Mosiah on a regular basis. They wearied him with their teasings, basically like, hey, what's going on with them? Hey, what's going on? Hey, have you heard anything from those? What should we do? How can we find out some more information about our brethren who took off? In verse 2, it came to pass that King Mosiah granted that 16 of their strong men might go up to the land of Lehi Nephi to inquire concerning their brethren. Now, whenever we see strong men in the Book of Mormon, you see this as well in the Bible. They call it mighty men. They're typically not called that as just an adjective or a description. Hey, let's go find 16 of the strongest guys in the village and send them out to look for these men. They're actually more likely from the warrior class. So they would have been either professional military or reservist military, people who were accustomed to challenges, surviving in the woods or the jungles or whatever the topography was. People who were accustomed to thinking on the fly, creative problem solving, getting out of a problem if they happen to stumble into one. So they're not just going to send out somebody who's untrained, who doesn't know how to navigate, who might get lost, who can't survive in the woods. They're going to send out people from the warrior class because that's who would be able to navigate through and accomplish this particular task. They find 16 of their strong men, people from their warrior class, and 16 that's not a big number, but it's not a small number as well. If you look at ancient armies were rarely to a massive size, even though the numbers would indicate such. Throughout the Roman Empire, at the empire's peak, across the entire empire, they might have had 700,000, 750,000 total soldiers dressed across the entire empire, which is basically the Mediterranean world. So when you look at medieval armies, they might have been numbered in the thousands. And so 16 to go off on this particular venture would be just about right. You can't have too many because then you have to feed those people. So the logistics of it would be difficult. 16 you can feed off of a mid-sized animal if your provisions run out and now you've got to go hunt. It's a lot easier to forage for 16 people than it would be for 200 people. So it's a good number to send out on a scouting mission. And we find out that their leader's name was Ammon, and he was a strong and mighty man and a descendant of Zarahemla, and he was also their leader. So we're establishing his provenance. He's a descendant of Zarahemla. Now, that comes into play a little bit later in our story. It carries weight, but when you look at a hierarchical society, who your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather was can become important as you start to look at bloodlines and as you're communicating with leaders from other countries, principalities, kingdoms, whatever. Being able to establish your provenance is very important. So we're certainly doing that. We find out that they're in the wilderness. It says 40 days. A lot of times the numbers are meant to indicate a long time, right? He's out there for quite a while. Was it exactly 40 days? maybe but is it 42? Is it 45? Right? Let's just throw 40 out there. And they wandered 40 days, and they pitch their tents. Ammon takes 3 people, and they go into the city of Lehi Nephi. And in verse 7, we find out that they're taken and put in prison. Well, that's not the kind of greeting that I'm sure that they were expecting, but it certainly is the prudent sort of response if you are of this particular group. Who are these guys? You've got 4 warriors, strong men, coming into your village or town, or however big it was, and we don't know. We don't know who they are. So the prudent thing would be to take them prisoner, put them in bonds, and then have a discussion, have a council, and sit down and talk about it. Are they people who mean to do us harm? Are they people who can, who are friendly to us? Are they the priests of Noah, who, as we know later, had escaped into the wilderness and had kidnapped daughters? And are these nefarious people? We don't know yet. Let's put them in jail till we can find out. So that's kind of what happens in verse 8. It came to pass that they had been in prison 2 days, and they were brought before the king. The bands were loosed, and basically it's and I like how they say this. They were permitted, or rather commanded, that they should answer the questions which he would ask of them. Who's he? King Limhi, the son of Noah, who was the son of Zenith. So we now establish King Limhi's provenance here as well. So he's the grand, kicked this whole thing off, and took the people back to the land of their inheritance. And he said, "Who are you?" Verse 10, "I desire to know the cause whereby you were so bold as to come near the walls of the city." So we have an established city here, at least with walls of some sort. And what I would myself is with my guards without the gate. So I'm outside, I'm with my guards, and you just brazenly show up. Who the heck are you? And he says, and that's why I let you live. I needed to find out who you were. Verse 12, and when Ammon saw that he was permitted to speak, he went forth and bowed himself before the king, like any good supplicant would, or somebody who's afraid for their life. And rising again, he said, "O king, I am very thankful before God this day that I am yet alive. Thank you for not killing me. And I'm permitted to speak. And I can tell you who I am. I will endeavor to speak with boldness." Verse 13, "For I am assured that if ye had known me, ye would not have suffered that I should have worn these bands. Now let me tell you who I am and why you shouldn't have locked me up. For I am Ammon, and I'm a descendant of Zarahemla." So there's that provenance. I am an important and significant person. You probably didn't want to put me in jail. It wasn't a "don't do this, do you know who I am" kind of thing, but it's more, hey, if you had only known who I was, you probably would have made a different decision. And I'm a descendant of Zarahemla, and I've come out of the land of Zarahemla to inquire concerning our brethren, whom Zenith brought up out of the land. Hey, we're just looking for you. We want to see how you're faring. And now it came to pass in verse 14 that after Limhi had heard the words of Ammon, he was exceedingly glad, and said, "Now I know of a surety that my brethren who were in the land of Zarahemla are yet alive." And it's probably something that we're just not accustomed to, is not knowing what's going on the other side of the world. Back in this time, 121 BC, you pretty much didn't know what was going on in the next town. Most people would grow up and live their lives in the same area. They weren't just up and moving around a lot. Now there were traders, and those traders were going across the known world. There's evidence of tin from England being in Jerusalem. There's evidence of spices from the Himalayas, making it to Rome. So at this time, 121 BC, there certainly was global trade. When we say global trade, regional global trade across the Mediterranean and those areas that we know about. There's also military, sorts of excursions. Alexander the Great went from, and this is what, 320 BC, went from Macedonia all the way through India and Afghanistan and back down and around through Palestine and Egypt. So there were people who were traveling great distances, but by and large, especially in the farmer class, they didn't. They didn't know what was going on in the next city. They didn't know what was going on across kingdoms, from one kingdom to the next. And so we see evidence of that. Now, who knows exactly where it was that they were, but they were clearly 40 days journey. They were far enough away that they would have lost touch with the people of Zarahemla. And the people of Zarahemla were wondering about them, just like they were wondering about the people of Zarahemla. So very grateful. And in verse 15, for behold, we are in bondage to the Lamanites and are taxed with a tax which is grievous, aren't they all, to be borne. And now, behold, our brethren will deliver us out of our bonds or out of the hands of the Lamanites, and we will be their slaves. There's a couple things that I noticed as I read that. The first is he's already, there's just 16 guys, but he's already convinced, well, the people of Zarahemla are looking for us, and that's a great and mighty kingdom. They're certainly going to come and rescue us. And in verse 15, and he says, and we'll be their slaves. It's better to be slaves of the people of Zarahemla than it is the slaves of the Lamanites. In fact, he says that, for it is better that we be slaves to the Nephites than to pay tribute to the king of the Lamanites. I mean, it must have been bad if you're looking at rescue as being a slave just to a different person. Well, let's move from being slaves here to being slaves there, and that's a step up. So that tells us a little bit about their situation. It was dire. And now King Limhi commanded his guards that they should, and this is verse 16, no more bind Ammon nor his brethren, but cause that they should go to the hill which was north of Shalom. This is where the rest of the 16 were camped, and bring their brethren to the city so they can eat and drink and rest. Get him in, I'm sure, after 40 days camping in the wilderness, a shower or a tub of some sort, a nice meal and a nap would be welcome. They suffered many things: hunger, thirst, and fatigue. Okay, so he's essentially now committing to this idea that the people are going to be rescued because they're in this dire circumstance, and that rescue is, hey, we're better off being slaves. So there's that. Verse 17, and now it came to pass that on the morrow that King Limhi sent a proclamation among all his people, that thereby they might gather themselves together to the temple to hear the words which he should speak unto them. So probably something important to point out here, that the temple is still the center of their religious system. They are on an Old Testament law of Moses religious system still, and having a temple was important to that. Now, what we don't know is if when Zeniff went back to the city, that he was able to use the existing temple that had been built by by Lehi and their ancestors, or if this was a brand new one. We don't know about that, but we do know that throughout the Book of Mormon, temples were built, and those temples were Old Testament temples. So the sacrifice according to the law of Moses. That's probably significant. There's probably an object lesson in that the temple was the center of the religious system all throughout the Book of Mormon, and is the center of our current Latter-day religious system as well. Well, once the pandemic ends and quarantine ends, and we can go back about our normal life and cadence. It will be, as it sits right now. Obviously, our homes, apartments, condos, whatever, that seems to be the center of our current religious system. A home-centered, technology-focused, supported, gospel, I guess, is kind of where we're at with it now. And verse 18, and it came to pass that when they had gathered themselves together, he spake unto them in this wise, saying, O ye my people, lift up your heads and be comforted, for behold, the time is at hand, or for not far distant, that we shall no longer be in subjugation to our enemies, notwithstanding our many struggles, which have been in vain. Yet I trust there remaineth an effectual struggle to be made. I like that. I like how he turns that phrase. Hey, we've tried. We got a lot of struggles, and none of them worked. Hopefully, this time it'll be more effective. And so raise your heads, because we're in it. We're finally in a good place. Verse 19: lift up your heads and rejoice, and put your trust in God, in that God who was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he goes on and on, talking about how he takes them out of Egypt and parts the Red Sea, etc. That God. I wonder, it feels like Limhi is just so excited that Ammon shows up, that unless there's conversations that happen that we're not completely aware of, that he's bringing everyone together, and he's like, look, they are alive. Look, we're going to be free. I wonder if he's jumping to conclusion. Just from a human aspect, I wonder if Ammon's kind of sitting there going, oh, what? We're going to do what for you? We're going to rescue you so that you can be our slaves? That's not exactly what my mission parameters were. My mission parameters were, come here and find these people and see if they're okay. It wasn't anything about insurrection and rescue and slavery. This is all moving pretty quickly. It's kind of how it feels. But one of the things that we do see through all this is that King Limhi, he was a good guy. And he loved his people, and he cared deeply for them and wanted to improve their situation. He wanted to give them hope. And so obviously the first step is to have a meeting at the temple. The next step is to tell them to lift up their heads and say, this time we're going to have an effectual struggle versus all the other struggles that have been in vain. This time it's going to work. And this time I'm actually going to eat healthy and exercise. And this time I mean it, as opposed to all those other times when I said it, but it was ineffectual. So I kind of laughed a little bit about it, but it's certainly humanizing if we look at it that way. Lift up your heads, put your trust in God. Let me skip over to 20. He's still kind of going on about the story about how God delivered them out of Jerusalem, with the people of Lehi, preserved them up until now. And behold, it is because of our iniquities and our abominations that he has brought us into bondage. Hey, we're in this bad spot because we earned it. We deserved it. Now, we know the story, and because we know the story, we know that this is accurate. Is that always the case? Are we always in bondage or in bad situations because of our iniquities and because of our own personal sins and abominations? Well, the answer to that is sometimes we are. Sometimes we dig our own hole, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes we're in a bad spot, and we'll see it later in the Book of Mormon, where bad things happen to good people. Bad things happen to good people because of choices of bad people. Sometimes they happen to, bad things happen to good people because of the amorality of nature. And by that I mean stuff happens. Tornadoes don't just target bad people. They just kind of drop down and destroy everything that's in their way. And there are good people that end up in bad positions because of the amorality of nature. But certainly, whenever we find ourselves in bondage due to our own bad decisions, we've earned that. That's on us, and that becomes something that's completely avoidable. We could have made better decisions. And if we make better decisions on a go forward basis, we can get out of that spot that we're in. We can get out of that bondage that we're in. And so whenever we start thinking about bondage, that bondage could be real bondage, as the Nephites here are in with the Lamanites, but it can also be a bondage to something, to an addiction, to sin, to bad behaviors, to a life out of balance or out of control because of bad decisions that we're making. And whenever we find ourselves in that situation, an effective struggle against that bad situation in order to put us back on the straight and narrow path is in order. And it should be something that should allow us to lift our heads and trust in God. Yes, we believe in the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ. We believe that we can be forgiven of our sins, that we can grasp hold of that iron rod again, and we can make progression towards that tree of life. We should, if we believe in that, then there is certainly cause to raise our heads and have trust that this time the struggle will be effective. Verse 21, and ye all are witnesses this day that Zenith, who was made king over this people, he being overzealous to inherit the land of his fathers, therefore being deceived by the cunning and craftiness of King Laman, who having entered into a treaty with King Zenith, and having yielded up into his hands the possessions of a part of the land, or even the city of Hyde Nephi, and the city of Shalom, and the lands thereabout. So here's what we have. We have a bad deal. King Zenith was so focused on this one thing that he wanted, which was to inherit the lands of his ancestors, that and it says he's being overzealous to inherit this land of his fathers. Was he deceived? I don't know if he was deceived or not. He certainly made a bad deal because he was emotional. Well, that's one of the things in business that they tell you is don't get emotional. There's always the next deal. There's always something else to buy. You're out shopping for a car, and this, what the car salesman trying to do is get you to fixate on that specific car. You don't want it to be gone before you're ready to buy it. Well, we've got 3 other people looking at it. Same with realtors. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's, you're creating an emotional attachment, and you have to come and get in here and get this thing. But the problem is that when you have that emotional attachment, you are now prone to making a bad deal, as opposed to being willing to walk away from a bad deal because, look, I really wanted this, but you're not offering me a fair, or what they call in economics, an arm's length transaction, right, where we both benefit from this. This is something that benefits you, but not me. But since I want it so bad, I'm willing to make that bad deal. And that's kind of what I perceive here. Whether it was because the king of the Lamanites was smarter, or he was cunning, or he was he said crafty and cunning, or maybe he was just a better businessman, and he had this thing that he knew that Zenith wanted really bad, and so you keep asking for a little bit more until he says no, and he's willing to walk away from the deal. Turns out Zenith wasn't, so he made a bad deal. In verse 22, and all this he did for the sole purpose of bringing his people into subjugation and bondage. Well, yeah, Yeah, and by the way, this is actually how the feudal system and economics works. Right? The deal was the tribute paid to the Lamanites was half of our corn and our barley and even all of our grain and every kind, half of our increase in flocks, half of our herds, half of this, half of that, right? And that's how it works. If you are a serf or a peasant farmer and you're growing potatoes in Ireland, you get access to the landowners or the landlord's grounds so you can plant your food, and the rent that you pay is half of your crop. Whether there's good weather or bad, whether the crops fail or not, you still have to pay the man. And that's where the whole sharecropping and where you have the peasant serfs, and you see this throughout medieval periods up even into early 1900s in Russia, which was why there was so much strife with the serf class in Russia, pushing back against Tsar Nicholas II, right? So it's not something that was strange or different. This is how feudal economies work. When they don't work is when the serf class or the peasant farmer is not able to eat. They're not able to grow enough food. If there's a bad day, if there's a bad crop, if there's a bad storm, if something happens, and suddenly they're not able to feed themselves in that moment of trial. Sorry for that little glitch there. Turns out my kids decided that right now was a good time to have a pillow fight or a wrestling match or something. So if you heard any background noise, that's what that was. So I was able to pause it, and so I guess let's kick it back off. Apologize for that. I don't expect they'll be making any more noise for the next for the rest of the lesson. As we were discussing, the important thing is they made a bad deal, and so so here we are. They're in a bad spot. They're living in a way where half of everything that they were able to grow, they lost. And now if you're a Lamanite, that's a good gig. You can sit back and let somebody else do work for you. You can sit back and benefit from food. And if you recall, right, the Lamanites were more of a hunter-gatherer sort of society. And so having some Nephite serfs growing food, farming for you to provide you with food just in case you aren't able to get your deer, get whatever it is that you're out looking for from a game perspective. It's a nice safety blanket. It's a good gig if you can get it, and then why not? I don't see anything nefarious here other than the fact that if they didn't give half of their food, the Lamanites would kill the Nephites. So there's that, right? At the end of verse 22, Lamanites extract all these things of us or our lives. And so, yeah, you pay up or die, I guess. And so if you have a bad crop, there's a storm that kills your food, your cash crop, whatever it is, right? Your potatoes, your beans, your corn, and the Lamanites are there saying, well, I expect 50 bushels, that's my half, and you've only got 50 bushels, they're going to take everything. And that's the way it works throughout time in memoriam. When you have a feudal economy put in place, the man gets paid first, the serfs get to eat whatever's left over. So and you see this in times of war as well. The army would come through and take extra because, well, you've got to feed the army, or the opposing army, the enemy comes over and takes all of your food. Then what happens? Well, you're left trying to figure out how you're going to survive, and many didn't. They would starve, and you can see that across the globe at this particular time. So a very common scenario, basically what I'm trying to say, but still oppressive, certainly, and it's one where the people would absolutely be looking for some kind of deliverance. And obviously, it's bad enough that if you're going to do it, we would prefer to be slaves to a more friendly group of people, which they're obviously hoping that the Nephites would be rather than the Lamanites. And verse 23, and now is not this grievous to be borne? And is not this our affliction great? Now behold, how great reason have we to mourn? Yea, I say unto you, great are the reasons which we have to mourn. It's a bad deal. For behold, how many of our brethren have been slain? And we'll get into, and we'll find out more about what that looks like as we get into, well, it starts off with, chapter 9, and we get into the record of these people that's translated and put into the Book of Mormon. So we've got some foreshadowing that's going on here. We don't necessarily know what it is at this point if we're reading it for the first time, but what we're finding out is that people were slain, the blood was spilled in vain, all because of iniquity. Right? There's that if-then scenario again. If you keep my commandments, then you will get this blessing. If you don't, then bondage is going to be, your lot. And that's really where they are. This, all these bad things happen because of their iniquity. For if, and then there's that conditional formatting, and for if this people had not fallen into transgression, the Lord would not have suffered that this great evil should come upon them. But behold, they would not hearken unto his words. So it's, they're getting the outcome that they've chosen. They made some bad decisions. They chose not to hearken, and now they're paying the price for it. There arose contentions among them, even so much that they did shed blood amongst themselves. And we see that, right, with Noah, with the priests of Noah. They killed Abinadi. Verse 26, it said a prophet was slain, and all because he came there in verse 27 and said, and because he said unto them that Christ was the God, the Father of all things, and said that he should take upon him the image of man, and it should be the image after which man was created in the beginning. Or in other words, he said that man was created after the image of God, and that God should come down among the children of men and take upon him his flesh and blood. A nice synopsis. I mean, obviously, Abinadi had a lot of other things to say, but if we look at it, basically, he's telling us that Jesus is the God of the Old Testament, the God that Jehovah, right, the God that they would worship, and that Jesus or Jehovah would come to earth, would take on flesh, and would, offer himself up as a sacrifice for his people. And so we're seeing here just a high-level summary of what we're going to get later when we get into more detail around Abinadi's message to King Noah and King Noah's priests. We're also just confirming that Jesus is the God of the Old Testament, that they're not two separate gods, right? And you hear that from time to time now, that there's Old Testament God and there's New Testament God, and Old Testament God is mean and vengeful, and New Testament God is love, and very different people. No, they're not. The Old Testament is Jehovah, Jesus, and Jesus comes to earth, and we see it right here. It takes on flesh, and that same flesh that is in his own image. Verse 28, and now because he said this, they did put him to death, and many more things did they do. And then many more things we get into, the whole stories with the priests of Noah, and kind of how nefarious that they were, right? So we've done all these bad things. We're getting exactly what we deserve. Now, hopefully, is the time of our deliverance. Our brothers have found us, and we can certainly see a light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully this time it's not a train. I think is kind of how I interpret this. Verse 28 or 29, sorry. For behold, the Lord has said, I will not succor my people in the day of their transgression, but I will hedge up their ways that they prosper not, and their doing shall be as a stumbling block before them. He's repeating it back, right? And I've said it probably 5 times already tonight. And I say that tonight. I'm filming this at night. So they have right now the life that they've chosen. And the life is theirs because of their iniquity, because of all the things that they've done wrong. And if they want a different outcome, they have to change their behavior. You know, the whole, what do they say? If you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to keep getting what you've got. And what they've got is not awesome. They want something more, something better. And if that's to occur, they need to change. And they need to throw off that iniquity that they're just strapped with, that they're burdened by. They need to have, not just individually, but as a society, they need to have this the societal, this community awakening. They need to come together in repentance and belief and faith. And then he starts to lay out the law of the harvest. And again, he saith, if my people shall sow filthiness, they shall reap the chaff thereof in the whirlwind, and the effect thereof is poison. And again, he saith, if my people shall sow filthiness, they shall reap the east wind, which bringeth immediate destruction. So here's one of those interesting little nuggets. The whole idea of reaping the east wind, and the east wind being immediate destruction, is actually an old world thing. It's something that they would have brought over with them from Jerusalem, and it would have been this cultural idiom. It would have been something that may not have made complete sense where they were now. But in Jerusalem, you know, the north wind would bring cold down from the Caucasus, north of Jerusalem, north of Syria into the Russian Caucasus. So a wind that would come through, like the Arctic Express that we have here, would have brought cold down. The west wind would have come off the Mediterranean Sea, and it would have brought moisture and rain. The south wind would have brought warmth coming out of Africa, and the east wind would have come across the desert, right? The sandy waste of the Arabian Peninsula, and in Jerusalem, that often meant sandstorms and destruction that would have come from them. In fact, in the Old Testament, the east wind was called the wind of the wilderness, and very poetic. But when that wind would kick up, quite often, not in every case, but quite often, bad things would happen. And so it was a harbinger of bad things and destruction. And so who knows if the east wind was going to be something where they happened to be in the city of Lehi, Nephi, but because it's something that has carried on over the generations, it's an old world idiom that is still, as a metaphor, being used. I've thought a lot about stuff that we say now that doesn't make a ton of sense, but did at one point in time, and maybe those meaning. It's always curious to find out what it is, what's the etymology of some of these things that we say, where did they come from, and how come we say them? Because we've just gotten used to it, or maybe even they evolve. I found out recently the etymology of the phrase humbug, and we attribute it a lot to Ebenezer Scrooge in the Christmas story. And he would say humbug, and the interesting thing is that humbug was not something that was intended to be um, bad or evil, or you know, it actually was. Barnum Bailey was actually called the Prince of Humbug. And a humbug was something where it was a known farce, or where he would have a living mermaid, but it was actually somebody with a fish costume on, would be a humbug. The people that would pay money to go and see it could clearly see that it was a costume, but they were paying to be fooled, even though they really weren't. And so that's kind of that's the etymology of it, is this known scenario where we're trying to put one over on people who are already keyed into the joke. And so that's what a humbug is. And so when Ebenezer would say that, he was saying, this is a farce. This is, you're trying to pull one over on me. He wasn't saying anything dark or evil in any way, shape, or form, although it's kind of evolved into that, because I think we misinterpret, or we've lost that meaning. There's lots of things that are out there about that, and I don't want to belabor the point, but it certainly is one of those little nuggets in the Book of Mormon where King Limhi in 121 BC, calling the east wind that bringeth immediate destruction, would have been something that would have gone back generations all the way to the old world. How would Joseph Smith have known that? Well, he wouldn't have. But there it is, right? It's one of those little nuggets that I just find absolutely fascinating. Verse 33, but if ye will turn to the Lord with full purpose of heart, and put your trust in him, and serve him with all diligence of mind, if ye do this, he will, according to his own will and pleasure, deliver you out of bondage. And that's the crux of this whole chapter. We're in this bad spot. We're here because we chose it. We're here because of iniquity. And he's speaking to the people at the temple, right? The right place to be. And he's saying, this is a sign. We've got these people from Zarahemla who have found us. We're going to change, and we're going to be delivered, not just literally, but also spiritually. We can be relieved of this bondage, and that really is the message to me, to us, is that any time that we choose sin, we're choosing death, we're choosing bondage. And if we are not super excited to be in that bondage, then the decisions that we make need to change. We need to turn to the Lord with full purpose of heart, as it says in verse 33, and put our trust in him and serve him with diligence of mind, and obey the commandments, right? Trust and obey, because there's no other way, to quote the hymn from last week. And so here we have it. We have this moment of anticipation, this moment of, I suspect for King Limhi, relief, excitement, not because they're reached their destination, but because they now have hope where they didn't before. And he's preaching to the people to take advantage of this opportunity to turn away from your iniquity, to turn to the Lord. And he himself said that he will deliver you out of your bondage and deliver us out of our collective bondage. So some really good stuff there. I won't get into the details of chapter 8. Chapter 8 is some very interesting. Chapter 8 is where we introduce the fact that that there are two different sets of records that King Limhi has. He's got the records of the Jaredites, because he had sent people out looking for Zarahemla. And while they didn't find Zarahemla, they found the land of the Jaredites. They found the records of Ether. We introduced the fact that Mosiah was a seer, and a seer is a little bit different and more significant than being a prophet. And so we have that conversation and introduction. He also has a chance to read through the records of the people of Zenith. And that's what we start, on start in chapter 9 all the way through chapter 22 of Mosiah, is we get into the backstory. What are those transgressions? What are those evil things that were done? Why do the people of Limhi find themselves in this bad spot? And how were they able to extricate themselves from it? So it's, again, there's a lot of plot line stuff here. It's a lot of really interesting stuff. There's some compelling object lessons as we get into it. But the most important message from today, I'll just reiterate, we just discussed it, is if you're in a bad spot, change, get out of that spot. And the way to do it is to turn away from your iniquity and turn into the willing and patient and loving arms of the Savior. And verse 3, I'll read it again. But if you will turn to the Lord with full purpose of heart and put your trust in him and serve him with all diligence of mind, if ye do this, he will, according to his own will and pleasure, deliver you out of bondage. And that is my testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.